We're loving and hating and making scenes. Now we just see everything we believe.
Hello, what is going on, guys? This is your boy J Money here, and welcome to part 2 for returning Yu-Gi-Oh players. For those of you who maybe have missed part 1, this is going to be a multi-part series, specifically for returning Yu-Gi-Oh players that have either been out of the game before Master Rule 4's inception or left the game right as Master Rule 4 kicked in, because again, a lot of people have left the game due to links, and with the rising number of representations, not only at big events like YCSs or things like that, but we have also broken attendance records for regionals and things like that. So it's it's only safe to assume that there's a lot of people returning to the game as well. So with that being said, part 1 we left off at the end of Extreme Force, and we are doing part 2 today for staples. We're talking about staple cards that people should be aware of, or people should pick up if they have the budget for these cards. And these are featuring budget and non-budget cards alike. So with that being said, enough of the talk. Let's go ahead and get started with the next set, being Flames of Destruction. Now, spoiler alert, Flames of Destruction has a lot more cards than I anticipated, so there actually is going to be a part 3 of a staple segment, because there's a lot of cards that people do see, that just see play in and out of main and extra and side decks. So we're going to start with the most popular cards in Flames of Destruction, and that is the Nightmare cards. Now, we're only going to talk about 3 of them because they do see the most play. There's 2 other extra deck Nightmare monsters that see some fringe play here and there, and a main deck, or 2 main deck ones actually at this point. But for the sake of time, we're going to talk about the most common 3, being Nightmare Phoenix, Nightmare Cerberus, and Nightmare Unicorn. These cards are played in almost every extra deck because they're extremely generic. Each Nightmare extra deck monster requires 2 monsters just with different names. Again, that's extremely generic. Almost any deck can make. And the reason why they're played in so many decks is because of, just the vast utility and how generic their effects really are. So, let's start off with Nightmare Cerberus. Now, keep in mind, every Nightmare Link monster has an effect that discards its cost, and if they were co-linked when that effect was activated, you get to draw a card. And each Nightmare Link monster also has a passive effect that involves monsters being co-linked or linked. So we're going to start with Nightmare Cerberus. As I said before, Nightmare Cerberus, you discard a card and you can target a special summon monster in the main monster zone, destroy it, and if it was co-linked, you draw a card. As I said, all Nightmares have that particular effect when co-linked. Also, its passive effect, co-linked monsters cannot be destroyed by card effects. That comes up a little bit. Not as much anymore, because extra linking is fairly difficult unless your deck can support it. Now let's move on to Nightmare Phoenix. Nightmare Phoenix, you discard a card on link summon, and you target a spell or trap on the field and destroy it. And yeah, again, if it's co-linked, you draw a card. Also, co-linked monsters cannot be destroyed by battle. So combining Phoenix and Cerberus, if you are playing a bunch of Link monsters, can prove to be rather resistant to a lot of different things. And then the last one we're going to talk about is Nightmare Unicorn, because Nightmare Unicorn is a Link 3, so again, 2+ monsters with different names. If it's Link Summon, you can discard a card, you target a card on the field, and shuffle it into the deck. Just instant non-destruction removal. That's really good. And of course, if it's co-linked, you draw a card. Also, this effect really doesn't come up, but during the draw phase, you can draw cards up to the number of co-linked Nightmare monsters you control instead of conducting your normal draw phase. Again, it doesn't come up too much, but it's something worth noting. Again, these cards are incredibly generic because everybody plays spells and traps outside of decks that play Sekka's Light, which is actually another card that I do want to talk about. And yeah, everybody special summons unless it's True Draco. So yeah, Nightmare Phoenix, Cerberus, and Unicorn are played in almost every extra deck for this reason because of how generic they are. So moving on, I did spoil it earlier, but we're going to go ahead and bring up Sekka's Light. Now, Sekka's Light is a fairly interesting card because its effects are great, but it requires you to deck build around it. Now, Sekka's Light, in order to activate this card, you have to have no spells or traps in your graveyard. And when you activate this card, you draw 2 cards. Also, for the rest of the turn, you cannot activate spell or traps except Sekka's Light. So if you get into more copies, you can play those. And also, it has the effect to where you can banish it from the graveyard, and then you can reveal one monster in your hand, shuffle it into the deck, then draw another card. That's also really good for, just getting rid of the garnets out of your deck and going for like a mini mulligan, especially if it's something you need in the deck and you don't want in your hand. Again, you have to deck build around a card like this, but considering it not only gets you a draw 2, but it can get you a mulligan all in one go, I'd say that's pretty good. Especially if a deck can really support it and doesn't really play a lot of monsters to begin with, like say Burning Abyss. So that's it for Sekka's Light. Next, we'll move on to a hand trap, actually. There's a hand trap that, we all know every April, May-ish, every second set of the year, there's always going to be a new Ghost Girl. And, this year's, last year was no exception. I'm talking about a new Ghost Girl called Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion. It is essentially the exact same as Ash Blossom, to where, like Ash, it can negate any card that would move something from the deck. Ghost Spell negates any card that would move a card from the graveyard. So, special summon from the graveyard, add from graveyard to hand, deck, or extra deck, or banish from graveyard. So this card stops one of the other really good cards in this set that I'm going to talk about. But again, it's really straightforward. It's essentially like a mini Necro Valley. It does negate activations. That's something worth noting. So during the damage step, if you have something that gets an effect that's, moves something out of the grave, like add something from grave to hand or special summon from grave, when destroyed by battle or something, you can use this card. Something worth noting. Next, we do have a really, really good card that, if a lot of you guys aren't aware of, you should really look at. And, this is just one of those cards that are necessary for the game because before links, I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys were aware that a lot of hand traps were being played and there wasn't really too many ways to stop them, and you just had to just eat them. You just had to deal with hand traps, and it was really discouraging a lot of the time. But with a new quick play spell in this deck named Call by the Grave, that changes absolutely everything. So Called by the Grave is a quick play spell that it's very straightforward. You target a monster in your opponent's graveyard. When it resolves, you banish that monster, and if you do, the effects of that monster of the original name are negated until the end of the next turn. Now, you're looking at this, you kind of scratch your head a little bit because you try to figure out how is this that good, but considering that every hand trap outside of the side frames discard as cost, you can respond with this card while it's in the graveyard before that said hand trap resolves, and banish it and negate the effect so you can continue doing whatever it is you're trying to do. Now, keep in mind this can be negated by what I mentioned earlier, Ghost Spell, because it does banish from the graveyard. So Ghost Spell can counter this card. So yeah, that's something worth noting. Also, Call by the Grave, because it negates the effects until the end of the next turn, you can also use your opponent's Call by the Grave against them. So, example, if both players have an Ash Blossom in their hand, and I'm going second, and my opponent decides to, play out their turn, and they use an effect that makes Ash Blossom live, that is very, very, you know, a crucial point for their effect to resolve, and I discard my Ash Blossom, and they respond with their Called by the Grave. Because the effects are negated until the end of the next turn, if I decide to play, I know even if my opponent has Ash Blossom in their hand, they cannot, well, they can use it, but the effects will still be negated because it applies to both players. So that's a nifty interaction worth noting there. So again, Called by the Grave, very, very vital if you want to negate hand traps. So that's it for Called by the Grave. Now we're going on to another card that is really, really good, especially in this format, and that is Red Reboot. Now, Red Reboot, for those who don't know, is it's really seeing a lot of play, especially in a lot of side decks, especially now with all the decks that are playing all kinds of back row. But the reason why this card is so good, because if you look at it, reading its effects, it seems really bad on paper, and I'm going to go and read that out to you. So if your opponent activates a trap card, you can negate the activation of that trap card, then your opponent resets that card, then on top of all of that, they can set another trap card from their deck. But for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot activate trap cards. So it's essentially, it gives them an extra card, but it locks down trap cards for the entire turn. But what's interesting about this card is that if you can pay half your life points to activate the card straight from your hand. So you can use this as a spell card in a sense, and it is a counter trap. So you can use this against other counter traps. One of the most popular ones right now being Salmon Great Roar. So what's really great about this is that if you are playing a deck that can put a lot of damage on the board, Red Reboot can be an absolute godsend, especially against decks that play quite a bit of floodgates to begin with. So if your opponent has like a set 4 board, this card locks it all down for just one turn. You do get one turn though, so if you don't beat your opponent, you may lose the game because that extra trap card, again, they can choose any trap card they want to set. So this card is a high risk, high reward card, depending on the right deck you're playing. And, that's really something that you really need to have at least 3 copies of going into this game. And the last card from the set known as Flames of Destruction is actually one of my favorite cards right now, and that is Infinite Impermanence. Now, Infinite Impermanence is essentially a better version of Effect Veiler in almost every way. So, with this card, when it resolves, you can target first off, you target a monster on the field, you negate its effects. That's pretty nice. If it was set when this effect was activated, any spell or traps in that column are also negated for the rest of the turn. Now, it is a normal trap. It's not a continuous trap, so you'd wonder, well, why is that relevant at this point? Well, it lingers the entire turn. That zone lock for spell and traps lingers the entire turn. So if your opponent isn't careful and they don't pay attention where you had, what zone your impermanence was in, and they activate a card in that zone, the effects of that card are negated. So your spell and trap, or their spell and trap, actually got essentially doesn't work. So that's a nice fringe application there. Also, if you really want to stop a certain spell or trap and they just slip up and play it in the same zone as Impermanence while it was set, you can just chain Infinite Impermanence and just target like any monster. It doesn't even need to be something you need to stop. You could literally just do it just to turn off their spell or trap that they activated. But what's even better about this card is if you control no cards on the field, you can activate this card straight from your hand. So it literally acts as an Effect Veiler on the opponent's turn if they went first. Now keep in mind, it doesn't say you can activate this the same turn it was set. So you don't get the spell and trap lockdown ability if you activated the card from your hand. But the reason why I like this so much is because Call by the Grave is extremely popular because hand traps are everywhere. Because it's a trap card, yeah, it completely dodges Call by the Grave because Call by the Grave can only banish monsters. Not only that, but Infinite Impermanence resolves on the field and not in the graveyard anyway, so even if it was a monster, Call by the Grave wouldn't be able to respond to it. So there's a lot of applications that this card has going for it over Effect Veiler, and a lot of instances, especially in the, application of stopping spells and trap cards. So that is finally it for Flames of Destruction. Again, there was a lot of really, really solid cards in the set. So now we're going to move on to a mini set, actually, a side set being Dark Saviors, because Dark Saviors, has, 3 different archetypes. For hires, newly supported vampire cards, but most notably they introduced the Skye Stryker cards, and I'm going to talk about a few of these cards in package form because a lot of decks can play these cards, not just the Skye Stryker deck itself, because of how generic they are. Now, just a quick word of warning, every single Skye Stryker card except for, I think, the field spell and multi-rule, you can't activate them if you control any monster in your main monster zone. So you have to essentially have just an extra deck monster up top, or just no monsters on the field altogether to activate these cards. But they're definitely worth it if you're playing the right decks for them. If you're playing a spell-heavy deck, then the Skye Stryker cards are maybe something you might want to take a look at. Now, each Skye Stryker card, again, can only be activated when you control no monsters in the main monster zone. They give you certain effects, and they also give you bonus effects if at the time of activation there were 3 or more spell cards in your graveyard. So let's start off with the main one, Skye Stryker Engage. When activated, you add any Skye Stryker card from your deck to your hand. Then, of course, if there are 3 or more spells in the grave, you get to draw 1 card. So it's essentially a Pot of Greed, except one of those 2 cards was searched. Keep in mind, none of these cards are hard once returned, so if you see multiples, you can activate multiples. So if you, let's say, activated multiple Toon Table of Contents, and you now have 3 spells in the grave, and you have 2 engages, you get to search 2 cards and draw 2 cards. That's pretty absurd. So it's no wonder why this is, the main card. It's always being played at 3. Next you have Hornet Drones. Hornet Drones is the only one that's actually on the ban list, and it's limited for a very good reason because of how generic it is, and it was just token generators. It was really good for link climbing. So Hornet Drones, essentially, if you control no monsters in the main monster zone, you can just summon a Skye Stryker Ace token. Now, the reason why that's so good is because of one of the extra deck monsters that I will go into later. But if there are 3 or more spells, it gains 1500 attack. The token has to be summoned in defense, so this part doesn't really matter all that much. Now, moving on, we're going on to Afterburners. Afterburners is, you target a monster on the field, you destroy it, and if there are 3 or more spells in the grave at the time of activation, you get to destroy a spell or trap on the field, no target. That second part doesn't target, which is pretty good if you want to out also a floodgate-ish kind of card, or some kind of lingering card that has really good applications. Moving on from that, we have Jamming Waves. Jamming Waves destroys you target a set spell or trap on the field, destroy it, and if you do, and if there are 3 or more spells in grave, you get to destroy a monster on the field, no target. So it is a reverse Afterburners, if you will. Not too much to say about that. Moving on to the last card we're going to talk about is Skye Stryker Widow Anchor. Widow Anchor is a quick play spell to where you target a monster on your opponent's board, or target a monster, on the opponent's board, negate its effects, or actually on the field, negate its effects, and if there are 3 or more spells in the graveyard, you get to also take control of that monster if you choose to. Now that gets pretty ridiculous, especially in the pure Skye Stryker deck. If there are 3 or more spells and you have multiples of these in your hand, and let's say a Horner Drones, you can chain every last one of these. So the fact that a lot of these are quick play spells can really get ridiculous pretty fast. But again, if you're playing a deck full of heavy spells, like invoked based decks, or anything else for that matter, there's a lot of decks that can splash these cards. Now, there is one extra deck monster I do want to talk about, and that's Skye Stryker Ace Kagari. And when it's link summoned, or special summoned, should I say, you can target one Skye Stryker card in your graveyard and just add it to your hand. So you can see how something like that would get ridiculous rather quickly, especially since all of those cards were not hard ones per turns. If you activated Horner Drones to further the token and went into Kagari, you could re-add Horner Drones and activate it again since your main monster zone was open. And yeah, it made for very easy link climbing. Or in Skye Stryker Pure, you could just re-add Engage after you activated Engage and likely drew a card off of it, and then activate, search another card, and draw another card. Yeah. The Skye Stryker package is pretty ridiculous, if splashed in the right deck. This is something you definitely need to keep your eye on, especially since Skye Stryker Pure, at the time of making this video, is a highly represented deck. So, anyway, guys, that is going to be it for part 2. I will cover the rest of the cards in part 3, so look out for that. Let me know what you guys' thoughts are regarding part 2. And if I, did a good job, did I miss anything, all of that good stuff. So anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. This is J Money, and I am signing out.